Hi, this is Sean D'Souza from psychotactics.com, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about working less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy your work and enjoy your vacation time.
This is the 3-Month Vacation. I'm Sean D'Souza. Philosophers often say you cannot step into the same river twice. And that's because the river has changed and you have changed. And with that thought in mind, we're going to run these episodes once again. 4 of them back to back. These have been the most popular episodes of 2015. They're also some of my favorites. When listening to them, you'll find that you've heard them before, but somehow you've changed and the information seems different, almost new. When I sat down to do these reruns, the first thing I did was listen to them. And the moment I listened to them, I wanted to make some change. So I spent about 30 minutes changing the music, editing it, re-editing it, trying to fix it somehow. And really, that's not the point of history. The point of anything is to leave it as it is because it shows us our flaws and our mistakes. And so after 30 minutes of fiddling, I've stopped, and you're going to hear the podcast as it was originally broadcast. So that's the first lesson of 2016. Let's not erase the past because it has lessons for us. Interestingly and ironically, this episode is about mistakes and why it takes us 10,000 hours to reach our goal when, if we just looked at the mistakes, it would take us a fraction of that time. Have you ever watched a 16-year-old go for a driving test? They probably practice for 2 or 3 weeks off and on, and then after that, they drive. Now imagine they changed the rules of the driving test. Imagine they said that you needed 10,000 hours to drive. How many of us would be on the roads today? Several years ago, best-selling author Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Outliers. Within that book, there was this concept of 10,000 hours. And the concept was very simple. It said that if you wanted to be exceedingly good at something, you needed to spend at least 10,000 hours. And as you can quite quickly calculate, that's about 10 years of very hard work or 5 years of extremely hard work. The interesting thing about the 10,000 hour principle is that 2 sets of people jumped on it. The people that had already put in their 10,000 hours in something and those who hadn't. But what if you hadn't? What if you hadn't put in those 10,000 hours? Were you doomed to be always untalented? Understanding this concept of the 10,000 hours is very important, especially if you want to take vacations. You have to get very skilled at a lot of things very quickly. And if you don't understand the concept, then you struggle for no reason at all. And in today's episode of the 3-Month Vacation, we're going to cover 3 things. The first is, why is the 10,000 hours true? The second, what are the biggest flaws in the 10,000 hours? And the third is, how do you go about shortening that process so that you just do maybe 1,000 hours? Let's start out with the concept of why the 10,000 hours is absolutely true. Now, nothing is absolutely true, but the 10,000 hour principle works for a simple reason. That is, we don't know that we're making mistakes. If you take a guitarist, say someone like John Mayer, or Eric Clapton, or B.B. King, and you look at how long they spent with their guitar, they probably spend in excess of 10,000 hours. But when you're starting out and when you're playing that guitar, you don't really know what mistakes you're making. And you don't really care. You're there just to play the guitar. And this is what a lot of artists do. This is what a lot of writers do. They spend enormous amounts of hours just fooling around, just playing their guitar, just drawing a cartoon, just writing something. And they make mistakes. They make a lot of mistakes. But the problem is, they don't know that they're making the mistake. So take, for instance, my own life. When I started drawing cartoons, I was probably just out of school. And I was drawing cartoons that were pretty flat. And one day, my friend Howard, he said, well, there's something wrong with your drawing. And I said, what's wrong? And he couldn't explain, but he said, they're really flat. And it was then I realized that I wasn't using perspective. Until that moment, I didn't realize. I'd been drawing for hundreds, maybe thousands of hours, but I didn't realize I was making a mistake. Several years later, I started doing commercial projects, and someone mentioned that my lines were too weak. Lines are too weak? What do you mean by lines are too weak? They couldn't explain. But I had to do my own research, and then I found that great artists have this variation in their line, the thick and the thin. And this is what most musicians, artists, painters, people who are talented at anything that you think are talented at something, they've spent thousands of hours just making mistakes. If you take the mistakes out of the equation, we don't have 10,000 hours. We have 1,000 hours, maybe less. If you go strictly by the rule book, you can fly a commercial aircraft after 1,500 hours. Now, admittedly, you're not going to get a job with 1,500 hours, but you can fly it. You can fly one of those big jets after having done just 1,500 hours. This is true for cartooning as well. This is true for writing. And it's easy to say that it's true, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we decided to prove the point. In 2010, we started a course that we knew for sure no one or very few people could do, and that is to draw cartoons. So people entered the course saying, well, I can't draw a straight line. And the ironic thing is that to be a cartoonist, you don't have to draw a straight line. You have to draw wobbly lines all over the place. But nonetheless, within 6 months, those people that joined the course and stayed for those 6 months were drawing so well that people were commissioning work from them. They were asking them, are you a professional cartoonist? And it's amazing because when you think about it, these are all business owners. They probably have an hour a day, 5 days a week. That makes it about 25 hours in a month. And in 6 months, that's 150 hours. Within just 150 hours, they change the perception of someone looking at them. And suddenly, to the outside world, these guys were cartoonists since they were little. But it doesn't take 150 hours to learn to drive a car. And that's because there are fewer moving parts, as it were. There are more moving parts with cartooning. You have to learn perspective and thick and thin and background, foreground, lots of things, lots of little things that make a great painting. And the same applies for writing, and the same applies for any language that you're learning. There are lots of these moving parts. And the difference between a guitarist that just picks up a guitar and plays and this person who's learning how to draw cartoons or write, they are running into mistakes, and those mistakes are being picked up very quickly and fixed. And so, yes, the 10,000 hours work, but they don't work when the mistakes can be picked up very quickly and fixed. And this is the reason why pilots don't crash planes every day. It's because they sit in a simulator, and the simulator picks up those mistakes, and it enables you to fix those mistakes. So yes, the 10,000 hours works, but only if you don't know what mistakes you're making. And when you're younger, there is no pressure to earn money or win any competition or do anything. So you're allowed to make those mistakes and then fix them in your own time. And this is why it takes 10,000 hours to get to that level of mastery. And while this brings us to the end of the first part, we have to explore the second part, which is, why does the flaw exist? Why don't we pick up these mistakes? The biggest reason why we don't pick up the mistakes is very simple. As we grow up, we're not supposed to make mistakes. We're supposed to get things right. When you do a test, nobody says, hey, you have to get 30% of your test wrong. You're expected to get it all right. And once you have this situation where there's pressure to always get things right, then we have a real problem. So people will routinely tell you, you should make mistakes, then you can learn from your mistakes. But you're not allowed to make mistakes, so it becomes a catch-22 situation. So when we sit down to write a book or a report, or we sit down to write an article, or we sit down to draw, or we sit down to learn Photoshop, we run into this situation where we are not making enough mistakes and not being able to pick them up quickly and not being able to fix them. The only way out of this problem is to have a system where you can make mistakes. And so this is what we do on the headline course, for instance. There is 1 week where you learn how to write the headlines and another week where you write the wrong headlines. And you would say, what's the deal? Why should you learn to write the wrong headlines? But think about it for a second. It's the same thing that pilots go through. They go through a simulator exercise where the plane is crashing. They have to learn to identify the mistake because mistakes are not apparent. The mistakes have to be highlighted. You have to run through the mistakes. And that's when the speed increases. The reason why we struggle and think that everyone else is talented is because somehow they've had time to get to those mistakes and fix those mistakes. And we don't have that time. As we grow up, we have more responsibilities and we have more activity and we have more things that we have to do. Getting straight to the mistakes and fixing those mistakes is what makes it powerful. If you look at talent as something that is inborn, you will struggle all your life because it means you can never have it. But if you look at talent as a reduction of errors, a reduction of mistakes, then you realize that you just have to find the mistakes and eliminate them, or at least reduce them, and you have talent. And so the flaw exists in the system that doesn't allow you to make mistakes. And this takes us to the third part of this episode, which is how to get there quickly. There are 3 elements to get to a talent very quickly. The first is the teacher, the second is the system, and the third is the group. If we start out with the teacher, then the teacher must have a method, and that method should be about creating safety. If you're intimidated, it is much harder to do anything because you're scared all the time. So the teacher must be able to create a safe zone for you. They must have the second element, which is a system. And the system must take you through tiny increments. When you say tiny increments, they need to be very small moves, like 1 inch today, 1 inch tomorrow, very, very small moves. And the reason for that is, supposing you were given a big move to make, and say I said move a few steps. Well, you could move 3 steps left, 3 steps right, 3 steps forward or backward. Now you have to come back 3 whole steps. Instead, if you make a very small move, which is 1 step, you only have to move 1 step back. And this is not usually the case. If any of you have done a photography class, you know exactly what I mean. In that one class, they will talk about exposure and f-stops and aperture and everything, and then you're completely confused. You're not able to take one step, and so you go back to your auto mode. And most photographers will tell you, you shouldn't be in auto mode, you should be in manual mode. That's the way to be. You should know your camera like your left hand or your right hand. But wait a second. Did you actually take one step at a time when you were teaching? Because even when you take a single step, you can be sure that at least a good section of your students have got it wrong. And now you have to bring them back. You have to bring them back to parity and then take them one step forward. And that's not how training is built. Training is not built by these tiny little increments. Books are not written with these tiny increments. There's chapter after chapter after chapter. And of course, we get lost. And so then we think we're not talented, when in fact the system is at fault. There aren't enough opportunities to make the mistake, for the mistake to be detected, and then for you to rectify that mistake. The way to fix this flaw is to learn in a group. And the reason why a group setting is so powerful is because the traditional way of testing someone is really bad. Remember when you were in school and everyone did their tests and you got some things wrong and somebody else got some things wrong, but eventually nobody got to see what the other person got wrong. So you'd do your assignment and you'd hand it to the teacher and she'd mark it and give it back to you, and only you could see what you'd got wrong. But if the entire group could see what you'd got wrong, they could learn from your mistake and you could learn from their mistakes. And this is the fundamental flaw in most training. We're not allowed to see everybody else's work, but when you see other people's work, you can learn from their work. And it seems quite obvious when someone tells you this, that you could learn from other people, but that's not how the system is built. And this is why it takes 10,000 hours to reach anywhere, or 10,000 hours to reach that level of mastery. People are not stupid. People are very, very intelligent. People have the ability to acquire talent. People have the ability to reduce their errors. But often it's the teacher, the system, and the group, or the lack of group, that lets them down. If you believe that someone else is more talented than you at cooking, at drawing, at painting, at writing, the reason is you haven't figured out the mistakes and removed them. Once you do that, you have talent. So let's summarize what we've learned so far. The first thing we covered today is the whole concept of the 10,000 hours. And was it true? And we found out, yes, it is true. It takes a long time because we don't know the mistakes. And if we don't know the mistakes, then we make them and we don't realize we're making those mistakes. The second thing we covered was the flaw that exists. And that is, people tell you to make mistakes, but no one gives you the chance to make the mistakes. There is no system in place. There is no whole week of let's make these mistakes so that we can learn from them. And this takes us to the third part, which is you have to have a teacher, you have to have a system, and you have to have a group. When you have these three elements, the teacher will work out the tiny increments and move you forward. The system will be not just how to, but how not to. And finally, the group will expose the errors of another 20 people. So now you're able to look at 20 errors and at least learn from them and possibly not make those errors in future. But the exposure to errors, that is the critical part of talent. Talent is simply a reduction of errors. So what's the one thing that you can do today? Probably the best thing that you can do for yourself is to stop looking at how to. Start looking at courses and training and systems that talk about how not to. Because unless they have both the how to and the how not to component, you're going to make errors that you don't even realize you're making, and then you get stuck. And the moment you get stuck, you think, well, this is not for me, I'm not good at this, I'm not talented, and it's not that at all. When the system is built with mistakes as part of the assignments, that's when you know that you're on the right path. That's when you know that you can do the same thing in half the time or a tenth of the time. And that's when you have more time to take breaks and go on vacation. And this brings us to the end of the episode. It's been quite a task just rerunning this because there's lots to clip at the front and at the back, and sometimes I wonder whether it's just easier doing a brand new episode. These are good episodes and they're worth rerunning. Another thing that is worth rerunning is going through your copy of The Brain Audit. The Brain Audit is multi-layered. It has lots of information within those chapters. So reading it again this year would make a big difference to how you perceive your sales letters, how you perceive your email. So read The Brain Audit. Join us in 5000 BC. I'll be back in 5000 BC in a few weeks, and it's a great place to be. While the new year is still fresh, one of the things that make a really good resolution is to get better testimonials. When you think of testimonials, you think of stuff that people say about you, which is good stuff. But how do you get outstanding stuff? How do you get 1,000-word testimonials? And how do you get 100 or 500 of them? You can find this out on The Secret Life of Testimonials. Read the book. You'll find it quite fascinating. And you'll find out what you've been doing wrong for so long. You can find that at psychotactics.com/testimonial. And that's it from Psychotactics Land. Bye for now.